No Bible verse on a woman's role has been more abused than 1 Timothy 2:12. Hi everyone, I'm John Stokes. Welcome to another adventure spelunking through my mind's dark depths. 1 Timothy 2:12 says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man." Taken at face value without additional context, that seems very restrictive on women. I've heard this passage used and abused to question female college professors, suggest we don't have to obey female politicians or police, and to restrict women in churches to only minister to children. But when we examine Scripture carefully, is it really that restrictive? When I was in my early 20s, just out of Bible college, I was trying to figure out what my role and responsibilities were as a Christian man in Western culture. So I did a study through Scripture on gender roles. I started at the beginning in Genesis and studied straight through every passage I could find in order. 1 Timothy is near the end of the Bible, so when I read it with the whole of Scripture in mind, it shocked me. There is no other verse in Scripture like 1 Timothy 2:12. While God only has to say something once in His Word for it to be true, if He only says something once, we humans have to take a hard look at it to be sure we're interpreting it properly. One of the main criticisms against any Bible interpretation is, you took the verse out of context. It's not a very helpful criticism because technically that's always true, and here's why. When we interpret Scripture, there are at least 4 contexts we must consider. First, the immediate passage. That is, what do the verses immediately before and after the passage in question say? Second, the whole of Scripture. What do other passages on the same topic throughout both the Old and New Testaments say about the passage? Unless you can quote the entire Bible in one sitting, you're technically always taking passages out of this context. Third, the audience. How would the people and culture who originally received this passage have understood it? And fourth, the group. Biblical directives are typically aimed at one of 3 groups: the family, the church, or the public. From my study through all of Scripture, I've reached these conclusions. In the family, the role of a man and woman are very clear. Multiple passages throughout Scripture state that the husband is the head of the wife. As the head, he is to sacrifice for her best interests, and she is to submit to him. In the public, there are no such restrictions. There are many examples through Scripture of women being political leaders, entrepreneurs, owning property, and otherwise participating in public life on equal footing with men. The church is where things are less clear. There are examples of female prophets, female evangelists, and female deacons. The one restriction that seems reasonably clear is that women may not be elders. So how do we interpret 1 Timothy 2:12? Let's examine it in light of these 4 contexts. We'll start by considering the audience. How would the original culture have understood this? We can get some clues by looking at the original language. The word for man in this passage is aner, which means man, fellow, husband, or sir. A fairly generic term, not very helpful. The word for woman is gune, which means wife or woman. A bit less generic, but both of these words can take on multiple meanings depending on context. So let's examine other context clues. In the context of the entire Bible, this verse is fairly unique. We need to examine the group Paul is addressing to know if we cross-reference passages on family, church, or public life. I found no such restrictions on women in public life, nor are there any indications in 1 Timothy chapters 2 or 3 that Paul is addressing public life. I can confidently say this passage does not apply to public life and therefore can't be used to justify disobeying female bosses, politicians, police, or other authority figures. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul begins a discussion on church elders. Since verse 12 is near the end of chapter 2, most people believe it's also talking about the church. That is, women in the church may not teach or exercise authority over men in the church. But there are a couple of problems with that interpretation. First, if we take the context of the whole of Scripture, where does that leave female prophets and evangelists? Aren't prophesying and evangelism forms of teaching? What if, say, a father overhears a woman teaching his children and accidentally learns something? Is he sinning? Is she? Second, if we look at the verses in 1 Timothy chapter 2 immediately before and after verse 12, we see Paul mention submission, which is usually used in the family context elsewhere in Scripture. He also talks about Adam and Eve, which were a family, not a church, and childbearing, which is clearly not church-related. Finally, the words for man and woman are often translated husband and wife. These clues from the immediate passage and Scripture overall lead me to believe the group Paul is speaking to in verse 12 is the family, not the church. It's also worth noting that the word for teach here is didasko, which implies a relationship between teacher and student. In English, we could probably also translate it tutor. That's in contrast to the word keruso, which means to preach or proclaim as to a large crowd. It's the type of teaching that could take place in a personal setting like a family, rather than a crowd like a church congregation. Therefore, based on the clues from the original language, the immediate passage, and the Bible as a whole, it is my opinion that a better translation of this passage is, I do not allow a wife to tutor or exercise authority over her husband. This translation brings this verse into greater consistency with the rest of Scripture, including Paul's other passages on wives submitting to their husbands. I hope that understanding will also prevent future abuse of this passage against women.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like and subscribe. And I do offer professional voiceover services if you need that sort of thing. Thanks again.